Chapter 5 Estrella came home just as the streetlights began to flicker on across the foggy, rainy evening. The heavy door lock clicked loudly in the narrow hallway. She pushed the wooden door open, dragging her feet across the threshold like she had bricks tied to her ankles. She didn't say a word. She didn't even look up. She just dropped her heavy backpack onto the linoleum floor with a dull thud, kicked off her wet sneakers and walked straight into the cramped kitchen. I watched her from the worn-out fabric sofa. She looked completely drained. Her thin shoulders were slumped beneath her damp, dark jacket. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened into something permanent, bruising the pale skin. Even from across the living room, I could hear her phone vibrating relentlessly inside the front pocket of her backpack, a muffled buzzing that sounded like a swarm of angry bees trapped in there. She ignored it. She turned on the tap, filling a cheap glass with cloudy water, and drank it down in one long, desperate gulp. We settled into a grim, unspoken routine over the last 4 days. I didn't ask her about the all-time present buzzing or the invisible social war that was eating her alive at school, and she didn't ask me how long I planned to sleep on her couch. We were just two ghosts haunting the same miserable apartment, bound together by a miracle that had completely ruined both of our lives. "The heating is broken," Asti finally said. She set the empty glass on the counter. Her voice was raw and raspy. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as she walked out of the kitchen and into the living room. "It's freezing in here. It's supposed to be June. It's an old building," I replied automatically. I pulled the heavy cotton blanket tighter around my shoulders. I had the tiny glass star hidden deep in the pocket of my oversized sweatpants, its jagged edge pressed reassuringly against my thigh. It was a microscopic battery of my old power, but it did absolutely nothing to warm up my fragile, biological human blood. Asti frowned, rubbing her arms. She walked over to the window and pulled back the plastic blinds to look at the street below. "No," she whispered, raising her brow. "This is different. Look at the sky." I pushed myself off the sofa. My bruised ribs immediately protested the movement. A sharp flare of pain radiated across my chest, but I ignored it and joined her at the glass. The gray, suffocating fog that usually covered the city had vanished entirely. Instead of it, the sky turned into a bruised, unnatural shade of violet. The clouds didn't drift lazily like in normal weather. They were twisting and spiraling violently like water circling in a drain centered directly over our district. The relentless rain stopped. The wind outside had died completely, leaving an eerie, absolute silence that felt heavier than the noise. And then the temperature plummeted. It didn't just get cold. The drop was violent and entirely unnatural. A layer of thick crystal frost bloomed across the outside of the window pane in a matter of seconds, crawling up the glass like a living web of ice. Asti took a terrified step back. Her breath was suddenly visible, puffing out in a small, white cloud in the air of the living room. "What is that?" The weather app said light rain. It's like a blizzard is dropping right on top of us. I pressed my bare hand against the cold glass. My blunt human senses were agonizingly weak, but my predator instincts were still intact. The hairs on my arms stood straight up, prickling against the cheap fabric of the oversized band shirt. A sharp, metallic taste flooded the back of my mouth. The unmistakable, toxic flavor of raw ozone and burning copper. My flat human teeth began to ache, a deep throbbing pain that reached right down into the roots of my gums. Get away from the window, I said. My voice was low, but the absolute urgency in it made Asti freeze still. Martha, what's going on? Back away from the glass, right now. She stepped back. Her eyes were wide with confusion and rising panic. Just as she moved, the overhead light in the living room flickered violently. It buzzed with an angry, high-pitched surge of raw electricity and then popped. The bulb shattered inside its glass casing, raining tiny shards onto the rug. The room instantly fell into shadow, illuminated only by the sickly violet light bleeding through the frosted window pane. From the hallway, Asti's backpack suddenly let out a horrific sound. It wasn't the standard vibration of a social media notification. Her phone was emitting a high-pitched, screeching dial tone that drilled directly into the skull. The screen was flashing bright, blinding white through the dark fabric of her backpack. In the corner of the living room, the old television snapped on by itself, displaying a roaring, hissing wall of thick gray static. "My phone!" Asti yelled over the deafening noise, immediately moving towards the hallway to dig it out. I lunged forward and grabbed her arm. My nails dug hard into her jacket. "Leave it! Don't touch anything electronic. But it's going to catch fire or something." "It won't," I snapped, holding her down to the floor, behind the low barrier of the fabric sofa. "It's just interference. The local neighborhood is being flooded with magic." Asti crouched next to me on the laminated floor. Her breathing was panicked and shallow. Her chest was rising as the television continued to hiss and pop. The temperature in the room was dropping so fast I could feel the unnatural cold seeping up through the floorboards, biting viciously into my bare feet and numbing my toes. "Flooded by what?" she gasped, pulling her knees to her chest. "What is happening out there?" "A gray mask," I whispered, keeping my head down below the window line. I closed my eyes, reaching out with my stunted human senses, trying to feel the agonizing weight of the magic pressing down on the city. "The department is blind, Estrella, but they aren't stupid. They are hunting me." "But you don't have any magic left. How could they possibly find you?" "Because of how I got here," I said. My teeth were beginning to chatter. I closed my eyes and the memory hit me. I hadn't just stepped through a polite, organized doorway to get to this world. I had been dying. I had been bleeding out on the sandy shores of the infinite lands, staring out at the foam of the ocean, while the hot wind tried to bury my body in the endless desert. I was fading into nothingness, but in a final, agonizing act of sheer defiance, I had gathered the absolute last microscopic drop of my ancient red power. I didn't open a door. I had violently ripped a jagged hole through the dimensional fabric and thrown myself through it, landing face first in the freezing mud of her city. That kind of violent, unauthorized dimensional tear leaves a scar, I explained to Asti. My voice was tight. A residual bleed of static energy in the local atmosphere. It's like leaving a bloody footprint on a white carpet. "And they're tracking it?" "They're scanning for it," I corrected. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs. The fear was raw, biological, and completely humiliating. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. They don't know exactly where I am, but they know the tear happened somewhere in this specific city. They're using a localized weather anomaly to mask their surge from the human population. The static, the extreme temperature drop, the violet sky, it's like a net. They're sweeping the entire district, looking for the exact coordinates of the bleed. Asti pulled her jacket tighter around herself. Her eyes darted around the freezing dark apartment. The television screen flared brighter. The gray static snapped with violent arcs of blue electricity. The sheer scale of what I had brought to her door was finally crashing down on her. The petty cruelties of her high school tormentors, the buzzing notifications that caused her so much dread, all of it suddenly paled in comparison to a sky that was trying to hunt us down. "We have to run," she whispered. Her voice trembled so hard the words barely formed. She started to push herself up. "If they're coming here, we have to get out of the building. We can go down the fire escape." I grabbed her shoulder and slammed her back down against the floorboards. "If you walk out into that street right now, you're dead," I said. My voice dripped with absolute certainty. "Do not move." "But if they find us running during an active sweep is a death sentence," I hissed, leaning in close so she could hear me over the hissing static of the TV. "This whole thing is designed to locate what, or I shall say who, they need. If you run, you trigger the motion shields, you light up for them like a flare. We are trapped in a concrete box on the top floor. All we can do is stay low, stay quiet, and pray the scan passes over this building without locking onto the residue." "And what happens if it doesn't pass over?" she asked. A single tear slipped down her cheek, freezing almost instantly in the air. "What happens if they find the coordinates?" "They send the hounds," I replied bluntly. There was no point in lying to her to protect her fragile feelings. Trackers, executioners, they'll sweep every floor, every hallway, and every room in the radius until they find the source of the anomaly. And when they find me, they will burn this entire apartment complex to ash just to make sure the job is done. Asti squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in her knees. She was shaking violently, completely overwhelmed by a terror she had no defense against. I looked up at the window. The frost had thickened into a solid sheet of white ice, creeping aggressively over the wooden sill and starting to freeze the ugly floral wallpaper. We were completely cornered. I reached deep into the pocket of my sweatpants. My blunt, freezing fingers brushed against the jagged edges of the tiny star. Instantly, a microscopic spark of heat flared against my palm. The tiny sleeping battery of red magic gave me hope. It wouldn't be enough to fight off a full squad of department mages. It wouldn't be enough to stop a hound in its tracks permanently. But it was a single bullet, and if a department executioner kicked that wooden door down tonight, I absolutely refused to die hiding behind a cheap fabric sofa like a helpless human. I let go of the star and grabbed Asti's arm again, forcing her to look up at me. "Asti, listen to me," I commanded, projecting every ounce of my old authority into my broken, raspy voice. "I need you to crawl into the kitchen. Do not stand up. Stay below the windows." She blinked at me. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Why?" "I need you to open the heavy drawer by the stove, find the heaviest, sharpest object you can get your hands on. A meat hammer, iron pan, anything." I locked my eyes onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "Bring it back here, and then you do not make a single sound. Do you understand me?" She gave a small, terrified nod. "Go," I whispered. She crawled away into the shadows of the kitchen. Her wet socks slipped silently against the freezing linoleum. I stayed crouched behind the sofa, my back pressed against the cold fabric. The television hissed. The phone screeched from the hallway. I wrapped my hand around the star in my pocket, staring at the locked front door, waiting in the suffocating darkness to see if the storm would pass or if the monsters were coming to collect their bounty.